And I now invite my colleague, Dr. Donna Brunero, to tell us about how she could or is trying to incorporate all that she's hearing from us today into her teaching.
Good afternoon. Really, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Interview and to Andrea for inviting me to come and speak to you today. I realize it's towards the end of the day, but I think we've been listening to a lot of very interesting papers, and I was so enjoying the presentation on Ayutthaya, I wouldn't have minded if it had continued because I was taking notes madly. I was asked to speak today about teaching in particular, and to look at maritime history from a pedagogical viewpoint. So in other words, how I look at maritime history in the classroom, but then try and bring it beyond the classroom as well. So this was my task for the conference, so I'm trying to follow through with that. I'd argue that looking at what we teach and the scholarship we draw on can actually be quite informative for when we're thinking about Asia's maritime history and maritime heritage. And so too, I think location is important, as Prof. Mixic mentioned. Location. I think being based in Singapore is actually very important for influencing the way that we handle subject matter. I would say what better place to study maritime history than a port city that has a long history. And we know that Singapore's history, of course, extends way back beyond Raffles to the idea of Asia's maritime Silk Route and the Temasek era. So I think we're well placed or well situated to be studying maritime history here. My presentation has three main aims. First is just to briefly survey some of what I see as some of the major scholarship or trends in maritime history in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. Second is to look at scholarship on the Asian port city or on Asian maritime history. And then third is to show you how I use some of this in my teaching. So I've been teaching at the National University of Singapore for about 5 or 6 years now. And I teach a number of courses, but many of them would be described as maritime history or touching on aspects of maritime history. So hopefully I can sort of incorporate the scholarship and then show you how I use it in the classroom. And I welcome your questions or comments from there. So the first part of my talk I would call Embracing the Sea. I was looking at an English Historical Review article of 2009 where maritime historian Glenn O'Hara pointed to David Canadyne's work and an observation that the sea had become pivotal when you think about modern British history. This made me think further, you see, because what O'Hara did by calling on Canadyne's work was to argue then that maritime history was enjoying a renaissance. And I think this is something that we have been speaking about today, this whole idea of a renaissance of maritime history. And in particular, the notion of intertwined histories or of connectedness and networks coming out of maritime history. And this from around 2009 onwards seems to be a more and more common refrain when we think about maritime history. And what I see as a blooming of the field of maritime studies in the last decade was most evocatively captured in an observation by scholar Karen Regan, and I've put it up, this quote, where she says, "Maritime scholarship seems to have burst its bounds. Across the discipline, the sea is swinging into view." And that for me really captures very much of the fascination that seems to have risen or a renewed interest in maritime history. As something I was discussing earlier during a tea break, that quite often when I would say I was interested in maritime history, I would often get a joke about I would end up with a parrot on my shoulder. And I think definitely our perceptions of maritime history have changed. And in terms of scholarship, it's very much from the mid-2000s onwards, there seems to be this renaissance or enthusiasm for looking at maritime history in new ways or seeing new possibilities beyond that of the traditional, which was perhaps naval history, sometimes much more national history oriented. So I think scholars can largely agree that there's a lot of opportunity now for maritime history to ride a wave of popularity, pardon the pun, but connected to the idea of global history. So thinking about maritime history as global, I think maritime history offers scholars the opportunity to look beyond the national histories, to tell interconnected histories, and do this via looking at trade networks, the movement of ideas, of people, of patterns of urban development, so port morphology, for instance, webs of labor that sustained maritime networks, and also looking at the sea to examine subaltern lives. I think this has become another major theme when we think about maritime history. So here the ocean has come much more to the fore as a focal point. Okay, now, while I think we still have to acknowledge the influence of Brodel's work on the Mediterranean as having forged or created the new way of thinking when it comes to the maritime realm, scholars have moved beyond Brodel's work very clearly. And what they have done, I think, most powerfully is revisited Brodel's work and brought fresh light to what has been considered the very classic Brodelian approach. And this is why they begin to look at scholars, and it's Michael North I'm thinking of in particular, and his work has just been translated into English just last month. There was a book launch, where he's also looking at another ocean, or looking at the Baltic, the history of the Baltic, but seeing it as a starting point for larger research. Whereas I think in the case of Brodel, there was a limitation, and particularly when we're thinking about geographic limitations. So I think Brodel's work has become a starting point, and more scholars are revisiting the classic works and departing from there. Ironically, what I see as one of the challenges, perhaps for maritime history, although many scholars here probably don't have this challenge, would be what I see as the sheer scope or the potential for maritime history. It's the limitlessness of the ocean that is in itself a problem. I think sometimes it can pose too daunting for scholars, and certainly for students, when they're thinking about maritime history. So a trend then, rather than to look at oceanic history in its entirety, is to perhaps think in terms of regionalization. And I think this is what has been happening quite often. And this is a way that you can make researching maritime history manageable by looking at a particular region. I think there's a lot of value in this, and I could think immediately of scholarship on the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia, the Mediterranean, of course, the Atlantic. All of these, I think, are great examples of a much more regionalization, a way of approaching maritime history in a way that makes it manageable for both the scholar but also for students that are trying to engage with this material. So this leads me to the second aspect of my presentation, which is looking at maritime history in an Asian context. And I do this in a really broad sense, particularly with my teaching as well, whereas I take this as meaning everything east of the Cape. So it's as broad as I can possibly make it when I think about the Asian context. There have been many ambitious projects, many examples of ambitious scholarship. And one example, and I've put it up, would be Pearson's work on the Indian Ocean. This is work that I use quite often in teaching. And Pearson himself, not just as a scholar but a proponent of maritime history, really extols that to study maritime history, you need to get a whiff, or you need to get a spray of salt water. So you need to have to be in touch with the ocean. And I think there is some strength in this, or there is some validity to the idea of encouraging scholars to embrace the ocean, very literally, have that connection to the sea. And of course, very recently, we've also had John Mixick's work, Singapore and the Silk Road of the Sea, which has woven together decades of scholarship and actually brings us a very strong sense of not just the East, but the Southeast Asian maritime world. So again, it really exemplifies this idea of a regional history, but one with a very strong connection to the oceanic, to the maritime world. So again, I see these two works, so Pearson's and Mixick's work, as an encouragement not just for scholars but for students to look towards the ocean or to look at the sea with a renewed interest. And we do tend to see that. I see that in my teaching in the Department of History, that more students come to talk to me about my teaching, particularly because they say, maritime history, it's something different, it's new. And I don't think maritime history is necessarily new, but they'll say it seems new because it has the potential of being very global. So they like the approach because they often see the potential to connect or to look at different regions. One of my concerns, however, is that what might be lost when we look at these larger regional networks, so scholarship like Pearson's, for instance, is that the stories of the littoral communities or the trading communities or the individual ports sometimes become lost or subsumed underneath these larger narratives of networks or hubs or webs of trade, for instance. So I think there is still value in considering the individual port or the port city, and I still think there is a lot of work to be done at that level. That although we do have the tendency to want to look beyond, a lot of ports there still hasn't been a lot written. So Ayutthaya, I was so happy to hear so much more about it because really I see there are a few key works, but there is so much that could still be done in terms of developing the history of individual ports. I think one of the ways that this has been addressed would be what I see as three works. Two are considered more classic works. One is a newer rendering, but a similar theme. Brides of the Sea, Broza, Macpherson, and Reeves, very classic work. This was one of the first works that really made this call for a renewed interest in the port city, the Asian port city. And the same authors, so Broza, Macpherson, and Reeves, followed up with their second volume called Gateways of Asia. So this was my exposure as a scholar, but I also exposed my students to these works, where you have many contributors looking at individual ports. So I think these are interesting in terms of volumes that were not only trying to look at the Asian port city, but look at many different port cities, and then allow readers to try and draw comparisons or parallels, and see the value in each of the case studies. A much more recent contribution to this would be the edited volume by Masashi, Asian Port Cities, which has just come out in 2009. It takes a similar approach and actually sees itself as updating or reviving the Brides of the Sea approach in terms of looking at different port cities and using individual case studies and seeing what interconnectivities you can make. Okay, so basically, the reason I'm showing you pictures of book covers is just to think about the importance of the Asian port city, the type of scholarship that you might be exposed to, particularly when you're thinking about students and when you're teaching as well, and how rich the scholarship is when we think about maritime history, but particularly the Asian maritime realm. And this is really only scratching the surface, very much so. So then how can this scholarship flow into teaching practices? I'd like to share with you two case studies. They're both brief case studies, different modules that I teach. The first one is called Brides of the Sea, Asia's Port Cities. Surprise, surprise. I actually named it partly in honor of Broza, Macpherson, and Reeves' book, because I found that was so influential in my own work that I felt it was a good way to title a module, plus it was catchy. And don't forget, you're always told, if you're going to create a new module, have a catchy title. And I thought, what could be better than Brides of the Sea? It actually worked. It worked very well. I actually had one student fall in love with another student, and then at his wedding, he could actually say, I met my bride in Brides of the Sea. So I was very happy about that. It's only happened once, though, and I've been teaching this for many years now. But this is a third-year module. It's an upper-level history majors module run as a seminar style, so it's much more in-depth where the students are really engaging with the material. We read on maritime history generally as an introduction, but then we use the Asian port city as the basis of our work. And from there, we use different ports, and we explore a number of very different themes. So these could be labor and the port city, technology and the port city. We might look at Colombo, for instance. We look at communities. One community that we look at is the Peranakans. And for that, I bring my students on a field trip. Usually we go to NUS Museum's Baba House. I select this because it's a preserved Peranakan house. What is also interesting for a maritime history course is that it was originally owned by the Wee family. Now, the Wee family is of Wee Bin and Co. fame. So this is a steamship, a family that owned a steamship company, a fleet of steamships. So I see that there's an immediate maritime connection. And so for the students, they can think about not just a port city community, but they can think about ideas of identity, business linkages. And what they'll often look at within this home is they'll begin to reflect on the nature of trade networks, what sort of commodities you see, and the way that Baobab House has been preserved tries to capture the 1920s, 1930s. They will look at features such as a brass bed frame, and they will say, oh, how is it that you can have the latest fashion from Europe being brought into Singapore? And partly it's about shipping connections, it's about trade connections. So they start thinking about the way that these connections can influence community and identity. So this is one of the case studies we do to Baobab House. So again, it's just to bring forth the idea of port city communities and actually going and looking and speaking with the docents and reflecting on how port city communities can be shaped. We've also visited and critiqued the Resorts World Sentosa Maritime Experiential Museum. I get the students to do a lot of reading before we go, particularly looking at Prof. Mixick's work again, but other scholars where we look at the history of commodities, such as the movement of ceramics, Roderick Patuk's work on pepper. So we look at specific commodities as well. And then we went and had a look at this museum. And we tried to look at narratives. Could we find a narrative, for starters? Trying to look at what sort of narratives were present, whether there are things omitted, tried to do an analysis of scholarship on Asian maritime trade, and then how it's represented when you begin to think about public consumption. How do the public respond to this type of material? So what understanding would you get if you had not done a lot of reading before coming to this museum? And as you can see, the students responded in different ways, particularly the students that drifted off and started making the models, which were actually set up for primary school kids usually. But anyway, they thought it was fantastic for that reason. But again, interesting to bring students out and not just think about maritime history, but get them really beginning to think about maritime heritage as well. So the way that what we read and the scholarship we're working on can somehow, the way that it can be reflected in public museums, so something like the Resorts World Museum. I do have future plans, which is very much keeping with Pearson's ambition, the idea that to really study maritime history, you must have a taste of the sea. Part of my idea is, and it's dependent on students, is to take them out to sail to some of Singapore's outer islands. I've always wanted to go to the lighthouses, but of course the lighthouses being functioning lighthouses, there are security issues. And I was told that with 50 students, I would pose quite a problem. So I think our suggestion, or what we're planning to do, would be to look at something like St. John's Island, where we can read on issues relating to port cities, disease and quarantine, and then go to what was a former quarantine station. So again, it's bringing the scholarship and bringing the students out of the classroom and getting them hopefully to engage with the material. I also have a session on piracy, hence I left up the picture, which always raises a lot of interest with the students. I get them to read on James Warren's work, Trocky's work, as well as primary documents relating to piracy, particularly in Southeast Asia. And then I have students playing out scenarios, role-playing, where they have to take on a persona and begin to negotiate with other personalities that they find in the class. What this usually does is it gives the students a sense of the complexity of the trading environment in Singapore, colonial Singapore in the 1800s, and also the sense that there were many gray areas when it came to policing a port. How do you ensure security? So whoever is appointed as a governor or an official, he finds himself continuously being harangued by the merchants, because the merchants are also concerned that their ships might be under threat of attack, for instance. So it's getting students to think through the documents that they've seen, sometimes taking on historical figures, and other times creating their own fictitious characters. But it can be very interesting and very thought-provoking in terms of the types of engagement they can have with not just scholarship, but primary material. And this is, again, at third-year level, so the students do actually put a fair bit of thought into it when they're doing these types of activities. Now, what has struck me with this seminar-styled module, as I said, Brides of the Sea, the third-year module, is that the students have a lot of interest in visual material in particular, and primary sources. One of my big concerns is that these sources aren't centralized. There is no one central point where you can really look at everything relating to the Asian port city. It's scattered everywhere. So I have a current project which I've received a small amount of funding for to create an online forum, and this is the first point. It will be a teaching aid specifically for my course, but hopefully open to the public, and then it can grow from there. To become a resource for material on the Asian port city, providing links to databases of material, for instance, and allowing my students a chance to showcase some of their writing, particularly when they're reflecting on the nature of the Asian port city. So this is some of the things that I am doing with my third-year students when it comes to maritime history. The second case study to share with you is a very different module. I think I partly feel this is why I've been asked to come here, because I get a lot of invitations of late to come to all sorts of places, junior colleges, for instance, to talk about pirates. So I'm beginning to develop a reputation as, I don't know if it's the pirate lady, I'm not quite sure what. But this was really a spin-off from my third-year module. The one session I do with my third-year students is always so popular, and so they're so enthusiastic about it, that for my department, I said, how about I teach a course on piracy? I thought initially they would say no, but actually they grabbed the idea, they love it. And it's been designed as a general education module, so not necessarily for history majors, but I do get a lot of history majors taking the module, surprisingly, but I also have a lot of geographers, and then everything ranging from life sciences, the full spectrum of students. And this course, I've offered it twice. I get a full enrollment of 150 students each time. So the potential is for it to expand, but I think I'm happy with 150. That's enough for me to manage. Through this module, what we do is we trace piracy as a historical phenomenon. I look from the age of the buccaneers, for instance, through the golden age of piracy. The Atlantic world in particular comes in. I look at privateering or state-sanctioned piracy with the students, and then I make a shift with the class, and basically we begin to look at this part of the world. So we look at the Sulu zone, we look at the Ming, the Qing, so we look at piracy in the East and Southeast Asian contexts as well, which really gives that much broader appreciation, and it doesn't turn into a very Eurocentric module. So students, as a result, are exposed to a wide range of materials, everything from Treasure Island to reading David Starkey's work on privateering, which I think is quite solid when it comes to scholarship. He's really the leading scholar, to reading James Warren's work on the Sulu zone. So really, it's a very wide range of material. And we come right through to the present day and read recent works on maritime terrorism, for instance. So we move out of history completely and begin to look at much more contemporary approaches as well. So what this module allows for then is a broad helicopter ride survey, that would be my way of describing it, over the history of piracy, but also issues relating to maritime violence. Hopefully what I do with this module is allow students to pick up on major trends or themes when they think about piracy. So they think about notions of power. They can think about the economics of violence, for instance, and the role of geopolitics, particularly when we think about maritime violence. But again, what I use for this module, even though it's a general education module, I use broader maritime histories to anchor the work, to give it a framework. So students have a sense of life at sea, the idea of life at port, of maritime worlds, of the nature of shipping, for instance. I also have an interdisciplinary aspect with this module because I have a physicist come into the class and we spend a whole session learning how to chart the oceans, which I think is also really quite amazing for the students, because it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to have the map in front of you, a chart, and being forced to calculate where you are in the ocean at a particular point, and to be guided through this, and to realize how difficult it would have been in the early days, so the 1600s, 1700s, how you navigated your way around the world's oceans. So for students to have that hands-on experience, I think is actually very valuable. It's been one of the most exciting sort of interdisciplinary aspects. Of course, the trade-off is I now have to go to physics and lecture over there, but I think I'll deal with that when it comes. Okay, and I included Captain Blood partly because one of the other things I do with this module is try to deconstruct popular culture. Every student comes into the module and generally all they want to talk about is Pirates of the Caribbean and One Piece, the Japanese comic series. And I try and take them back to what I see as the classics. So I say, you must watch Errol Flynn, Captain Blood. So for the rest of the session, usually for at least a good 5 or 6 weeks, I have students just saying, Errol Flynn, he's so ridiculously handsome. So they are swept away with the romance of piracy, and I talk about how is it that this is so evocative? What is it that is so powerful in terms of thinking about these popular culture images? And we move on. We look at Treasure Island and see how literature has had a role to play. Pirates of the Caribbean, I try and show the students where the continuity is with popular culture. And then, of course, I have students who themselves are piratical in disposition. These students were photographed. It's an 8 o'clock in the morning class. So they came to class 8 o'clock in the morning dressed as pirates. That was for my benefit, apparently. But yes, you can see that students really get very enthusiastic and they really enjoy this taste of what I see is not just a history of piracy, but it's a taste of maritime history in many ways. What is also significant about this module in particular is that it allows us to think about modern day issues as well. It's all well and good. Students enjoy the popular culture aspect, without a doubt. I see that as one of the good things that I'm able to do. I have them reading material from the 1700s, then coming through and critiquing Pirates of the Caribbean, for instance. And students who are non-history majors, non-faculty of arts students can do this with great relish by the end of the semester. But one of the other things I get students to do is to think about modern day issues relating to piracy or maritime violence, and particularly the concerns that we have in the present day when we think about national versus international waters, how waters are demarcated, how we understand demarcations, what are the loopholes or the problems with international law. So we look at this. And why is it that you have some areas which are known as pirate hotspots? So in particular, students, if I ask them about modern day piracy, they will immediately talk about Somalia. And this tends to be a reflection of their awareness of the film Captain Phillips, for instance, but then getting them to think about representations of piracy in the media as well and the way that this is played out. For instance, this image, I usually pose this, I put this poster up and I ask students, can you tell me where this is? Oh, okay, yes. You've got it exactly. Most students would just look and say, most dangerous waters in the world, where could that be? Then I give them the rest of the article. As it says, Asia's seas, okay? And down the bottom, it's actually pictured above is vessels off the east coast of Singapore. This is from a Time article, 2014. Students find this very confronting. And I said, I bet you've never looked at the East Coast in this manner when you're there cycling or having your McDonald's or sitting at the beach. I think this is very fascinating for students because it forces them to consider representations of modern day piracy. The idea that representations, how is piracy being represented? It doesn't, as I said to students, you need to be cautious or conscious of bias in materials, okay? Because we know that Southeast Asia is considered one of the hotspots in terms of piracy, but how we define it is another thing altogether. So students begin to grapple with this and say, perhaps it's all too easy to put up something as dramatic as this image and say, oh, it's Singapore, it's Southeast Asia, without going further. So students usually go off and start reading and try and work out what it is that would have triggered this type of article, and is there really substance? So again, it's to provoke interest more than anything else with the students and really get them questioning the popular media or the current media, particularly with representations of modern day piracy. And this module also attracts a number of students that did their NS in the Navy. So I have a lot of students that like to lend their expertise, and they will often come in and talk about issues in terms of security and the water. Okay, so finally, what this module does then is, in a very different way, introduces students to maritime history, but through the idea of piracy. We begin to think about the nature of container shipping, for instance, how the maritime world has changed so dramatically, and we can think about continuity and change, but the way that container shipping has really transformed the face of the maritime world in many ways. You don't talk about the grandeur of container ships. There isn't the same romance connected with container shipping, for instance. The crews are much smaller. There are much bigger issues to do with regulation of the crews, for instance. So students will begin to look at that and say, yeah, there also isn't the popular culture resonance with shipping. So some aspects of maritime culture and piracy have that enduring appeal. Others don't. So again, it's good for students to begin to question that. And I get students to watch Captain Phillips and also to look at websites such as the International Maritime Bureau, which I realize is a bit problematic as a website, but I get them to look at it in terms of why is it that you have these organizations set up to give live maps of piracy attacks all over the world? Who are they doing this for and to what purpose? Again, getting students to question, getting them to think beyond the readings that we cover. So this is basically sharing my 2 modules with you. I do teach other modules. I teach with Mr. Kwa, and I also teach on empires and the East India Company. I have students that follow me from the pirates module, and all I want to do is talk about the East India Company being pirates. It gets problematic after about the first 3 or 4 weeks, and I say, you're going to have to change because you can't just keep sitting in class and talking about pirates. We're talking about empires, something a little bit different. But you can see that definitely there's an appeal with this type of material. So my main conclusion would be that maritime history is a vibrant and exciting field. I think it's rapidly expanding, and it's in many different directions. And I think this raises a lot of exciting possibilities both for scholars but also for educators in terms of what we can expose our students to. One of the requests I've had is for looking at labor and the sea, students wanting to look at lascars, wanting to look at the whole idea of life at sea, but particularly from the labor element, so dock workers, shipbuilding, and so on. Whether I can put together a course, I'm not sure, but there is interest in this type of area, so much more the subaltern lives in the maritime aspect. And finally, I would say that location, again, is very important. To be positioned in Singapore and to be able to teach maritime history here, I think is really a fantastic benefit to any educator and to our students, because our proximity to some of the world's busiest waters actually lends an immediacy to what we're teaching, and students can make a connection. I think initially they may not have it, because in Singapore with the container shipping, there tends to be a bit of a distance from the sea. People feel a bit distanced from the port. When they start thinking about piracy or they start thinking about the evolution of port cities, they begin to make connections again. So I think this is where there's value as well, in terms of reconnecting students and getting them to think in terms of the ocean. Okay, thank you.